The night was supposed to be ordinary, but in just a few seconds everything shattered. A single action, a single moment of blind rage, and suddenly, silence. A door slammed. Footsteps faded into the distance, and for the first time in his life, Cassian Hale felt completely, devastatingly alone. At that moment he thought he had won, but what he didn't know was that he had just lost everything. What if everything you believed about your past was a lie? What if the person you trusted the most was the very one who destroyed you? And what if the truth had been right in front of you the whole time, but you were too blind to see it? Some wounds never heal. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. And some memories come back when you least expect them. Tonight, everything changes. The overhead lamp flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows across the walls of the small apartment in downtown Seattle. The faint smell of rain wafted through a slightly opened window, typical of the Pacific Northwest. Evenings. Cassian Hale, a man in his early 30s with dark circles under his green eyes and premature worry lines etched across his forehead, trudged through the front door. His shoulders were slumped under the weight of his charcoal gray suit, now wrinkled from a grueling 12-hour day at Robertson & Myers Real Estate, where commission-based sales kept him perpetually on edge. The apartment was modest but neat, a testament to Naraya's meticulous nature. Family photos lined the walls, their glass surfaces reflecting the unsteady light. In one corner, his mother Odessa's worn leather recliner sat like a throne. The old woman spent most of her days there, wrapped in her favorite cream-colored shawl, watching the world through narrowed eyes that missed nothing. The aroma of homemade chicken noodle soup, Naraya's specialty, filled the air, usually a comfort after a long day. But tonight, something felt different. The tension was palpable, like static electricity before a storm. Naraya emerged from the kitchen, her dark hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing the blue apron he'd given her for Christmas. Her hands were trembling slightly as she wiped them on a dish towel, and her eyes, usually warm and inviting, held a shadow of fear and determination. "She humiliated me again, Cassian." Naraya's voice quivered but remained steady, like a violin string, pulled taut. "She called me worthless, said I'm just draining you." Her words hung in the air like heavy fog. Cassian felt his jaw clench, his teeth grinding together as he glanced toward his mother. Odessa sat in her recliner, her silver hair perfectly styled. Despite never leaving the apartment, her thin fingers clutching her chest as if in pain, tears glistened in her pale blue eyes, carefully crafted drops that seemed to appear on command. She had mastered the art of looking fragile, though something in her gaze always suggested steel beneath the surface. "Shut up, Naraya," Cassian snapped, his voice harder than the marble countertops in their kitchen. The words exploded from him like shrapnel, each syllable sharp and cutting. He gestured toward his mother, whose lower lip had begun to tremble. "Look what you're doing to her." The sight of his mother's apparent distress sent waves of protective fury through his body. The blood rushed to his head, pounding in his ears like war drums. Naraya's attempts to defend herself became distant echoes, drowned out by the roaring. In his mind, all he could see was his mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, who had raised him alone after his father abandoned them, who now seemed so small and vulnerable in her chair. When Naraya grabbed his arm, trying to make him understand, something snapped inside him. It was like watching himself from outside his body as his hand rose in the air. Time seemed to slow down, each millisecond stretching into eternity. Then came the sharp crack of flesh meeting flesh, the sound echoing off the walls like a gunshot in an empty church. The silence that followed was deafening. Naraya stumbled backward, her hand flying to her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. In their 5 years of marriage, he had never raised a hand to her. Never even come close. The realization of what he'd done hit him like a bucket of ice water. But before he could speak, before he could apologize or try to explain, Naraya took another step back. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. With movements that seemed eerily calm, she picked up her purse from the side table, her keys jingling with a cheerful discord that felt obscene in the heavy silence. Without a word, she walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out, leaving behind a void that seemed to swallow all the air in the room. Cassian stood frozen, feeling the adrenaline drain from his body, replaced by a creeping horror. His hand, the one that had struck his wife, tingled as if burned. Behind him, Odessa sighed heavily, the sound somehow satisfied rather than distressed. She reached out her wrinkled hand, placing it on his shoulder with a grip that felt more possessive than comforting. "I always knew you were a good son," she murmured, her voice honey-sweet but somehow cold. The words should have been reassuring, but they sent a chill down his spine. Why did doing what his mother wanted feel so terribly wrong? Why did the silence of the apartment now seem to scream accusations at him? He stared at the closed door, something twisting inside his chest. An urge to run after Naraya, to beg her forgiveness, to promise he would never become that person again, surged through him, but he didn't move. Couldn't move. His mother's hand on his shoulder felt like an anchor, holding him in place as surely as if she'd chained him there. The overhead lamp continued to flicker, casting alternating light and shadow across the scene like a silent witness to the moment everything changed. Outside, Seattle's eternal rain began to fall harder, drumming against the windows in an endless rhythm that seemed to mock the beating of his guilty heart. The absence of Naraya transformed their modest Seattle apartment into a tomb of memories. Every corner seemed to whisper her name, every empty space a reminder of what Cassian had done. The morning coffee pot sat cold and unused. Naraya had always been the one to brew their morning blend, timing it perfectly so the rich aroma would wake them both. Now the kitchen counter felt barren, like a stage missing its leading actress. Even the air felt different. The familiar floral scent of her favorite Bath & Body Works Japanese cherry blossom perfume was fading from their bedroom, from his pillow, where she used to rest her head while reading her well-worn Stephen King novels. Cassian found himself pressing his face into the fabric at night, trying to catch the last traces of her presence, even as guilt gnawed at his insides. His mind worked overtime trying to justify that night. He was protecting his mother, wasn't he? Odessa was elderly, vulnerable. Didn't she deserve his defense? But every time he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, steam clouding the edges from his 2 hot showers, an uncomfortable thought crept in. His father had been a violent man. At least, that's what his mother had always told him. And Cassian had sworn, standing before Naraya in their small wedding ceremony at the Lake Union Cafe, that he would never become that man. The days stretched into a week, and Cassian started drinking. Not much at first, just a finger of whiskey in the evening, then 2, then half a bottle of Jack Daniels became his nightly companion. He knew where Naraya worked, at that bustling coffee shop in Pike Place Market. He could drive there in 15 minutes, could walk through those doors and see her. But what would he say? How could he explain what he'd done? Meanwhile, Odessa seemed to bloom in Naraya's absence. She hummed while stirring her thick soups on the stove, the ones that always smelled of too much garlic and memories Cassian couldn't quite grasp. "Now peace has returned to our home," she would say, ladling out portions that seemed to grow larger each day, as if trying to fill the void Naraya left with food. She praised him constantly, calling him a man who understood family loyalty, who knew where his true obligations lay. But something strange happened whenever he looked at his mother now. A sensation of déjà vu would wash over him, strong enough to make him dizzy. It was like trying to remember a dream that slipped away upon waking. Fragments of memories would surface, the sharp smell of bourbon, muffled screams from behind closed doors, trembling hands holding his own. But whose hands were they? The questions would fade as quickly as they came, leaving him more confused than before. Finally, after 7 days of silence that felt like 7 years, Cassian drove to the address Naraya's best friend had reluctantly shared. He found her in a small craftsman house in Ballard, looking tired but somehow stronger than he'd ever seen her. The Seattle rain fell steadily outside, creating a curtain of water between them as she stood in the doorway. "Cassian, can't you see what's happening?" Her voice carried a weight of contained pain that made his chest ache. She controls you, manipulates you, exactly like she did with your father. He laughed, but it was a hollow sound that died in his throat. The suggestion was absurd. His mother, manipulative, the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him alone. But when Naraya disappeared into the guest room and returned with a manila envelope, his hands went cold. Inside was an old photograph, its edges worn and yellowed with age. It showed him as a child, maybe 5 or 6, standing in what looked like their old apartment on First Hill. But it was the background that made his stomach drop. There stood Odessa, his mother, but she looked nothing like the frail woman who now sat in her recliner day after day. In the photo, she was staring directly at the camera, at whoever had taken the picture, and her expression. It sent chills down Cassian's spine. There was nothing maternal in that gaze. It was the look of someone calculating their next move, someone who saw people not as loved ones but as pieces on a chessboard. As rain continued to drum against the windows, Cassian felt something shift inside him, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface of his carefully constructed reality. The photograph trembled in his hands, and for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if everything he thought he knew about his childhood, about his mother, about his father's abandonment, might be built on a foundation of lies. The silence in the room grew heavier, broken only by the steady rhythm of raindrops and the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. Naraya watched him, her eyes full of a sadness that seemed to say she had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to finally begin seeing the truth that had been hidden in plain sight all along. Sleep evaded Cassian that night as he tossed and turned in his empty bed at the Ballard Inn, where he'd checked in rather than return home. The photograph lay on the nightstand, its presence almost palpable in the darkness. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw himself as that little boy with tear-stained cheeks, and his mother's cold, calculating stare seemed to follow him even in the darkness. The digital alarm clock cast a red glow across the room, its numbers changing with agonizing slowness. 2:37 a.m., 2:38 a.m., 2:39 a.m. Outside, the distant sound of a freight train's whistle echoed through the Seattle night, long and mournful. What had happened that day? Why couldn't he remember? The harder he tried to grasp at the memories, the more they seemed to slip through his fingers like smoke. As morning light began to seep through the thin hotel curtains, Cassian made a decision. He needed answers, and he knew exactly who might have them. His uncle Ezra lived in a rundown trailer park just outside the city limits, where he'd been, dwelling in a haze of cheap whiskey and regret, for as long as Cassian could remember. If anyone knew the truth about his childhood, it would be Ezra. The drive to the trailer park felt surreal in the early morning light. Dew clung to the windshield of his Honda Civic, and fog rolled in from Puget Sound, creating ghostly shapes along the highway. By the time he pulled into the gravel driveway of the Evergreen Mobile Home Park, his hands were trembling on the steering wheel. Ezra's trailer was easy to spot. It was the one with the American flag hanging upside down and empty Rainier beer cans decorating the small patch of dirt he called a front yard. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine needles and someone's burning leaves. Cassian knocked on the metal door, each rap echoing hollowly. When Ezra opened the door, he looked exactly as Cassian remembered, unshaven, wearing a stained Seattle Seahawks t-shirt, his speech slightly slurred even at this early hour. "Well, if it ain't my favorite nephew," he drawled, stepping aside to let Cassian in. The trailer smelled of stale cigarettes and instant coffee. Cassian didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pulled out the photograph and handed it to his uncle. At first, Ezra just chuckled, but then his bloodshot eyes focused on the image. The change in his expression was immediate and disturbing. All the color drained from his face, and his hands began to shake so badly he had to sit down on his worn recliner. "Cassian, you really don't remember, do you?" Ezra's voice was barely above a whisper. When Cassian shook his head, Ezra reached for a pack of Marlboros with trembling fingers. He lit one, the flame from his lighter dancing erratically. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. "When you were little," Ezra finally began, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Odessa. She wasn't the sweet old lady you think she is. Your father. He paused, taking another long drag. He wasn't the monster in this story. He was trying to protect you from her. Cassian felt a laugh bubble up in his throat, a nervous, disbelieving sound, but the serious look in Ezra's eyes made the laughter die before it could fully form. His uncle's face held no trace of his usual drunken humor. Instead, there was something that looked almost like fear. One night, Ezra continued, his voice growing hoarse. Your dad tried to run away with you. He'd seen things Odessa did when no one was watching. But she found out. The words hung in the air like poison. And then, Ezra's hands were shaking so badly now that ash from his cigarette fell onto his shirt. That was the first time she hurt you. The revelation hit Cassian like a physical blow. Memories began to surface, fragments he'd buried so deep he'd convinced himself they were nightmares. The sound of breaking glass. A woman's voice, not soothing but threatening. The taste of blood in his mouth. His father's face, twisted with desperation, saying something he couldn't quite hear. But she always said he abandoned us. Cassian managed to choke out. The words felt like glass in his throat. She said he was violent, that She's always been good at making people believe what she wants them to believe. Ezra interrupted, his voice bitter. Your father was many things, kid, but violent wasn't one of them. The only violence in that house came from her. Cassian felt the room spinning. He gripped the arms of his chair, trying to steady himself as his world tilted on its axis. Every memory he had of his childhood suddenly seemed suspect, like photographs that had been subtly altered. The loving mother who had sacrificed everything. For him, had that all been a carefully constructed lie? Why didn't you ever tell me? He whispered, his voice breaking. All these years. Ezra's laugh was hollow. Would you have believed me? Hell, she had everyone convinced. The neighbors, the school, even the damn police. Your father tried to tell people, but who was going to believe him over the poor, sweet, single mother? He stubbed out his cigarette with more force than necessary. By the time Ezra stopped, swallowing hard. By the time he what? Cassian pressed, though something in his gut told him he didn't want to know the answer. But before Ezra could respond, Cassian's phone buzzed. A text from Odessa. Where are you, darling? I'm worried sick. The words on the screen seemed to mock him, dripping with a concern he now recognized as something far more sinister. The drive back from Uncle Ezra's trailer felt like navigating through a nightmare. Seattle's familiar skyline looked alien against the steel-gray sky, each building a looming sentinel watching Cassian's world unravel. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white, and every red light seemed to last an eternity, giving his mind more time to spiral into the darkness of emerging memories. They came in flashes now, like lightning, illuminating a stormy sky. A child's birthday party, his 6th, maybe 7th. The other kids had gone home, and his father was helping him build a Lego set. Then Odessa's voice, sharp as broken glass, cutting through the peaceful moment. The why. Sound of something shattering against a wall, his father pulling him close, shielding him with his body. Cassian pulled over abruptly, his tires screeching against the wet asphalt. He barely made it out of the car before the contents of his stomach emptied onto the sidewalk. A couple walking. Their golden retriever gave him a wide berth, whispering to each other as they passed. The autumn rain fell steadily, soaking through his jacket, but he barely noticed. Every conversation with Naraya now played back in his head with crystal clarity. Her gentle warnings about his mother's manipulation. The way she'd notice how Odessa would cry on command whenever she wanted something from him. How his mother always seemed to have a health crisis whenever he and Naraya made plans to move to a bigger apartment or start their own family. By the time he reached their apartment building, the rain had turned into a downpour. Thunder rolled across the sky like drums announcing his arrival. The elevator was broken again. It always was. So he took the stairs, each step feeling heavier than the last. The familiar smell of his mother's cooking wafted down the hallway. Chicken soup, her weapon of choice when she wanted to appear nurturing. Where have you been, darling? Odessa's voice carried from the kitchen as he opened the door. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot with one hand while the other pressed against her chest, her usual pose of maternal concern. "I've been so worried. You know my heart can't take this kind of stress." For the first time, Cassian really looked at her, not at the fragile facade she presented to the world, but at the woman beneath. Her movements were too precise, her concern too perfectly calibrated. Even the way she tilted her head to catch the light, highlighting the tears gathering in her eyes, it was all a performance. "I went to see Uncle Ezra," he said, watching her carefully. The spoon in her hand paused for just a fraction of a second, so brief anyone else might have missed it, but Cassian saw it and something cold settled in his stomach. "Oh, that drunk?" She resumed stirring, her voice carefully dismissive. "You know he's never been reliable, always making up stories, especially when he's been drinking. Which is always." She ladled soup into a bowl, the steam rising like ghosts between them. "Come eat something, sweetheart. You look pale." Cassian didn't move from his spot by the door. "He told me about Dad." The words hung in the air like smoke. About what really happened. Odessa's hands were steady as she set the bowl on the table, but her eyes, for just a moment, flashed with something that looked nothing like motherly love. "Your father was a troubled man," she said, her voice taking on the practiced tone of someone who had told the same story many times. "I've told you what happened. He abandoned us, left us to fend for ourselves." "Did he?" Cassian's voice was quiet. "Or is that just what you wanted everyone to believe?" The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, another crack of thunder shook the windows. Odessa slowly turned away from the stove, and for the first time in his life, Cassian saw her mask slip completely. The transformation was terrifying. Her eyes, usually soft with manufactured concern, turned hard and cold as winter ice. "You've always been such a good son," she said, but the words held no warmth. They sounded like a threat. "Don't let that drunk fill your head with lies. Everything I did for you." She took a step toward him, one hand still pressed to her chest. "Who took care of you when you were sick? Who sacrificed everything to give you a good life? Your father?" She spat the word like poison. But Cassian could see it now, the calculation behind every gesture, every word. How had he been blind to it for so long? The memories kept coming. Nights spent hiding in his closet, his father's desperate attempts to shield him, the careful way Odessa would explain away any bruises or broken objects to concerned teachers or neighbors. "I remember," he whispered, and for the first time in his adult life he saw real fear flash across his mother's face. "I remember everything you did to him, to us." Odessa's face hardened into something unrecognizable. "You remember nothing," she hissed, dropping all pretense of frailty. "You were a child. Children's memories are unreliable. Everyone knows that." She straightened up, her movements suddenly sharp and precise. "Now sit down and eat your soup before it gets cold." The command was so familiar, so ingrained that Cassian almost obeyed automatically. But something inside him, something that had been sleeping for decades, finally woke up. He turned toward the door, his heart pounding. "Where do you think you're going?" Odessa's voice had taken on a dangerous edge he'd never heard before, or had he just forgotten? "To find out what really happened to Dad," he said, his hand on the doorknob. "Because he didn't abandon us, did he? Something happened to him. Something you did." The silence that followed was like the moment before an avalanche, heavy with impending disaster. When Cassian looked back one last time, he saw something in his mother's eyes that would haunt him forever. Not denial, not anger, but a cold, calculating satisfaction. As if everything was still going according to her plan. The Seattle Public Library's main branch loomed before Cassian like a glass fortress, its angular architecture casting strange shadows in the late afternoon light. Inside, the smell of old books and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights created an atmosphere of focused silence. His footsteps echoed off the metal and concrete as he made his way to the newspaper archive section, his heart pounding with each step. The librarian at the reference desk, An elderly woman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses helped him navigate the microfiche machine. Her fingers moved with practiced efficiency as she showed him how to search through old copies of the Seattle Times. "Looking for anything specific?" she asked, but Cassian couldn't bring himself to answer honestly. How could he explain that he was searching for evidence of his father's death? A death his mother might have orchestrated. Hours passed as he scrolled through endless reels of newspapers from 25 years ago. His eyes burned from staring at the screen, but he couldn't stop. Outside the library's massive windows, the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of purple and orange that seemed almost violent in their intensity, and then he found it. "Local man found dead at psychiatric facility," the headline read. The article was small, tucked away on page 12 of a Tuesday edition. Merrick Hale, age 35, had allegedly jumped from a third-floor window at Evergreen Psychiatric Hospital. The article mentioned a history of mental illness and paranoid delusions. A quote from his devoted wife expressed deep sorrow and concern about his deteriorating mental state. Cassian's hands shook as he printed the article. The photo accompanying the story showed his father, younger than Cassian was now, with the same green eyes and dark hair. But it was his expression that made Cassian's blood run cold. In the photo, taken at what appeared to be a company picnic, his father wasn't smiling. Instead, his eyes held a haunted look, like a man who knew he was being hunted. The drive to Evergreen Psychiatric Hospital felt like entering another world. The facility sat on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by towering pine trees that seemed to guard old secrets. The main building was a stark structure of red brick and narrow windows, many of them barred. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few cars belonging to the night shift staff. The night administrator, a tired-looking man named Marcus Johnson, was initially reluctant to help. But something in Cassian's desperate expression must have moved him. "Look," he said, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. "Most of those records were destroyed in a flooding incident years ago. But..." He hesitated, then pulled out a worn ledger from beneath his desk. "I keep this unofficial log. Been here 30 years. Seen things that didn't sit right." The entry about Merrick Hale was brief, but devastating. Patient exhibited no previous suicidal tendencies. Witnessed arguing with wife hours before death. Security footage from that wing mysteriously malfunctioned during time of incident. Wife insisted on immediate cremation, citing religious preferences not previously documented. Each word felt like another nail in a coffin of truth that Cassian had been avoiding his entire life. His father hadn't jumped. He'd been pushed, or worse, thrown. And Odessa had covered it all up with the same careful precision she'd used to manipulate everyone around her for decades, but there was more. Marcus led him to the old wing where it happened, their footsteps echoing through empty corridors that seemed to whisper with the ghosts of past tragedies. The window was still there, though now permanently sealed. Standing before it, Cassian could almost see his father's final moments. Not a suicide, but a murder orchestrated by the woman who had claimed to love him. "Your mother visited every day before it happened," Marcus said quietly. "Always brought him soup. Said it was his favorite." The words hit Cassian like a physical blow. The same soup she'd tried to feed him just hours ago. On the drive home, memories continued to surface. The way his father would check his food when Odessa wasn't looking. How he'd started losing weight in the months before his breakdown. The tremors in his hands that the doctors had attributed to anxiety, but might have been something more sinister. His phone buzzed with a text from Odessa. "Darling, I'm worried sick. Please come home. I made your favorite soup." The words made his stomach turn. How many others had she poisoned with her loving care? How many lives had she destroyed while maintaining her facade of maternal devotion? In his rearview mirror, the hospital disappeared into the gathering darkness, taking with it the last shreds of Cassian's childhood illusions. His father hadn't abandoned them. He'd died trying to save his son from a monster who still sat in her recliner, stirring pots of poisoned soup waiting for her next victim. The truth was a weight in his chest, heavy and cold. But with it came a terrible realization. Knowing the truth wasn't enough. Odessa was still out there, still perfecting her act of the concerned mother. And now that he knew, now that he remembered, how long before she decided he too had become a threat that needed to be eliminated? The evening wrapped Seattle in a thick blanket of fog as Cassian pulled into the parking lot of his apartment building. Each step up the stairs felt like walking to his own execution. The hallway seemed longer than ever, the flickering fluorescent lights casting strange shadows that danced along the walls like mocking specters. His mother's apartment door loomed before him, a portal to a truth he could no longer avoid. When he opened the door, Odessa sat in her usual spot, the recliner positioned to catch the dim light from the window. She looked exactly as she always had, a frail woman with silver hair and caring eyes. But now Cassian saw through the carefully constructed facade to the predator beneath. "You know," he said simply, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. The soup pot still simmered on the stove, filling the air with what he now recognized as a sickly sweet smell beneath the usual aroma of chicken and herbs. For a moment, Odessa said nothing. Then slowly, her face transformed. The mask of maternal concern melted away, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. When she smiled, it wasn't the warm expression he'd grown up with. It was the smile of a snake about to strike. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice different now, harder, sharper. "I was beginning to think you'd never figure it out." She gestured to the soup on the stove. "Though I suppose you won't be wanting dinner now." The casual way she acknowledged her deception made Cassian's stomach turn. "Why?" he managed to ask. "Why did you kill him?" Odessa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your father was weak," she spat. "He couldn't handle what needed to be done. He wanted to take you away from me." Her eyes gleamed with a fanatical light. "Nobody takes what's mine." "What needed to be done?" Cassian repeated, feeling sick. "What could possibly justify what you did?" "Love," she said simply, as if it were obvious. "Pure, unconditional love. The kind only a mother can give." She leaned forward in her chair. "Your father wanted to corrupt that love. He filled your head with doubts. He had to be removed." Way she spoke about murder, about his father's murder, with such calm detachment made Cassian's blood run cold. Memories flooded back. His father's desperate attempts to protect him, the mysterious illnesses that kept him home from school, the careful way Odessa would explain away any questions from teachers or neighbors. "And Naraya?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Was she going to be removed too?" "Eventually." Odessa shrugged as if discussing the weather. "She was becoming problematic, asking too many questions, trying to turn you against me." Her face hardened. "But you took care of that problem yourself, didn't you? Just like I taught you." The realization hit Cassian like a physical blow. Everything from his violent outburst against Naraya to his blind defense of his mother had been carefully orchestrated. He was becoming exactly what Odessa had molded him to be. "You're a monster," he whispered, backing away from her. But Odessa's smile only widened. "I'm your mother," she corrected, rising from her chair with surprising agility. "Everything I've done has been for you, to keep you close, to keep you mine." She took a step toward him, and for the first time Cassian saw something almost inhuman in her movements. "And now that you understand, we can be even closer. No more pretending." But as she reached for him, something in Cassian finally broke free. He saw himself clearly for the first time, not just as a victim of his mother's manipulation, but as an unwitting accomplice to her crimes. The way he'd struck Naraya, the way he'd defended Odessa blindly for years, it was all part of her careful programming. "No," he said firmly, backing toward the door. "This ends now. I'm going to the police. They need to know what really happened to Dad." Odessa's face twisted into something terrible. "They won't believe you," she hissed. "They never have. Who would believe that a devoted mother could do such things? I've spent decades building this reputation." Her smile turned cruel. "Besides, You're as guilty as I am now. Who struck his wife? Who defended his poor, helpless mother all these years? Your hands aren't clean anymore, my darling boy." The truth of her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had become complicit in her web of lies and manipulation. But as he looked at her, really looked at her, something else became clear. This wasn't about love. It never had been. This was about control, about possession, about a twisted need to own and manipulate. "Goodbye, Mother," he said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. But as he turned to leave, Odessa's next words froze him in place. "You really think I'll let you walk away?" Her voice had dropped to a dangerous whisper. "After everything I've done to keep you? You're mine, Cassian. You've always been mine. And if I can't have you," he heard her moving behind him, heard the soft clink of something being lifted from the coffee table. "Well, I learned long ago that some things are better destroyed than lost." The dimly lit hallways of Everett Springs Psychiatric Hospital felt like a maze of shadows and secrets. Cassian's footsteps echoed against the linoleum floors as he followed the elderly night shift nurse, Martha, through corridors that seemed frozen in time. The fluorescent lights above flickered occasionally, casting intermittent shadows that made the already eerie atmosphere even more unsettling. "Most folks don't come looking through records this old," Martha said, her keys jingling as she unlocked a heavy door marked Archives. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten memories wafted out. "Especially not at this hour." Her eyes, sharp despite her age, studied Cassian's face with quiet concern. Inside, the archive room was a cramped space filled with metal filing cabinets and shelves crammed with yellowing folders. Martha pulled a chain to illuminate a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. "What exactly are you hoping to find about your father, Mr. Hale?" Cassian's throat felt dry as he answered. "The truth, his death. It wasn't suicide, was it?" His voice cracked slightly on the last word. Martha's hands paused in their sorting through files. "I was here that night," she said quietly, almost whispering. "Something wasn't right. Your mother—" She glanced around nervously as if expecting Odessa to materialize from the shadows. "She visited every day with soup, always soup. And after each visit your father seemed different, weaker." Finally, she pulled out a thick file labeled Hale, Merrick, deceased. Her hands trembled slightly as she handed it to Cassian. "I kept my own notes," she said. "Things the official records don't show. The way your mother would whisper to him, how he'd beg us not to let her feed him. We thought it was paranoid delusions." Cassian's hands shook as he opened the file. Inside, beyond the official medical reports and intake forms, he found Martha's personal observations written in neat cursive on yellow legal pad paper. Each entry painted a picture more horrifying than the last. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with low-dose arsenic poisoning. One note read, "Brought concerns to Dr. Stevens, but wife's influence with hospital board led to dismissal of investigation." Another entry, "Mr. Hale increasingly agitated. Claims wife is making him disappear piece by piece. Attempted to warn son during visiting hours, but wife intervened." The final entry, dated the day of his father's death, made Cassian's blood run cold. Found Mr. Hale's last meal untouched. He knew something was wrong. Hours later, Code Blue called. Patient found on ground below window. Wire mesh screen had been cleanly cut. Maintenance confirmed damage occurred from inside room. Mrs. Hale demanded immediate cremation, citing religious beliefs never previously mentioned in patient's file. "Your father tried to tell us," Martha said softly, placing a gentle hand on Cassian's shoulder. "He knew what she was doing, but none of us believed him. She had everyone convinced he was just paranoid, delusional. She played the part of the devoted wife perfectly." Cassian sank into a nearby chair, the weight of truth almost crushing him. "She killed him," he whispered, slowly, methodically, and then made it look like suicide. Martha nodded grimly. "That's not all," she said, reaching into the file to pull out one last document. a lab report dated just days before his father's death. We did run tests on the soup she brought. Low levels of arsenic, nothing immediately lethal, but enough to cause the symptoms we were seeing. By the time the results came back, he was already dead. Cassian finished, feeling sick, and she had his body cremated before anyone could order an autopsy. "There's something else you should know," Martha said, her voice dropping even lower. "Your father wasn't her first victim. After everything happened, I did some digging. Her first husband before your father died under similar circumstances in a different state, and there was a nurse here, Caroline Matthews, who started asking too many questions about your father's case. She had an accident on the icy steps outside her house that winter." The implications hit Cassian like a physical blow. His mother wasn't just a murderer. She was a serial killer who had perfected her craft over decades, using the facade of maternal and wifely devotion to hide her true nature. "Why are you telling me all this now?" he asked Martha, though part of him already knew the answer. The elderly nurse's eyes filled with tears. "Because yesterday she came here asking about the old records, said she was worried about her son's mental health. She's already laying the groundwork, Mr. Hale, just like she did with your father." A chill ran down Cassian's spine as he remembered the bowl of soup sitting on his kitchen counter at home, his mother's insistence that he eat it while it was hot. How many times in the past few weeks had he felt slightly ill after eating her cooking? How many headaches and dizzy spells had he dismissed as stress? "You need to run," Martha said urgently, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "Run far away, where she can't find you. Because if you don't..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew how this story would end if he stayed. The drive back to Seattle through the rain-slicked highways felt like navigating through a nightmare. Cassian's mind raced with the horrifying revelations from the hospital archives, each streetlight casting ghostly reflections on his windshield that seemed to mock him with memories of his father's final days. The manila folder of evidence sat, heavy on the passenger seat, containing the proof of decades of calculated evil. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing. 7 missed calls from Odessa in the last hour alone. Each voicemail was more desperate than the last, her voice perfectly modulated to convey maternal concern. But now he could hear the predatory undertones beneath the sweet facade. "Darling, I'm so worried about you. You haven't been yourself lately. Come home, I've made your favorite soup, the soup. Always the soup." How many times had she served it to him over the years? How many headaches and unexplained illnesses could be traced back to her loving care? He pulled over abruptly at a rest stop, barely making it to the garbage can before emptying the contents of his stomach. Rain poured down mercilessly as he sat in his car, trying to piece together the fragments of his shattered reality. His phone lit up again. Not Odessa this time, but Naraya. His heart clenched at the sight of her name. After everything he'd done, everything he'd allowed his mother to make him become, did he even deserve to answer? "Cassian?" Her voice was cautious when he finally picked up. "Where are you? Your mother's been calling everyone, saying you're having some kind of breakdown." Of course she was, just like she'd done with his father. The pattern was so clear now, first the concern, then the whispered suggestions of mental instability, then the gradual poisoning disguised as nurturing care. How long before she started telling people he was showing signs of the same paranoid delusions that had allegedly driven his father to suicide? "Naraya, I need to see you," he said, his voice hoarse. "But not at your place, somewhere public." He could hear the fear in his own voice and hated it. "Please, it's important." They agreed to meet at Pike Place Market. Crowded enough even, at this hour to be safe, public enough that no one could disappear unnoticed. Cassian arrived first, positioning himself near the famous fish-throwing stand where he could watch all approaches. His hands shook as he clutched the file from the hospital. When Naraya appeared through the crowd, his heart nearly stopped. She looked beautiful, strong, everything his mother wasn't. The bruise from where he'd struck her had faded, but the memory made him sick with shame. I remembered everything, he blurted out as soon as she was close enough. About my father, about what she did to him, what she's been doing to me. They found a quiet corner near the original Starbucks, where the constant flow of tourists provided a buffer of white noise. Cassian spread out Martha's notes on the small table between them, watching as Naraya's face grew paler with each document she read. I knew she was manipulative, Naraya whispered. But this is monstrous. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of horror and understanding. The soup she always insisted on bringing over when I had the flu last year. Don't, Cassian cut her off, unable to bear the thought of how close his mother had come to adding Naraya to her list of victims. I'll never forgive myself for not seeing it sooner, for letting her turn me into... He couldn't finish the sentence. You were a victim too, Naraya said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. She's been poisoning you your whole life, not just with chemicals, but with lies and manipulation. The fact that you broke free at all is a miracle that might get him killed. His father had broken free too, had tried to save him, and ended up dead at the bottom of a hospital window. The same hospital where Odessa had been asking about him just yesterday. I have to stop her, he said, more to himself than to Naraya. She'll never stop otherwise. There will always be another victim, another accident, another convenient explanation for why people who get too close suddenly disappear. We'll go to the police, Naraya said firmly. Together, with this evidence. You don't understand, Cassian interrupted, his voice breaking. She's already started laying the groundwork, just like with my father. She's been telling people I'm unstable, paranoid. The same story, playing out all over again. He ran his hands through his hair in frustration. Who would believe the mentally unstable son over the sweet, concerned mother? She spent decades perfecting this act. The market's crowds continued to flow around them, tourists laughing and taking pictures, completely unaware of the darkness being discussed in their midst. A fish flew through the air at the nearby stand, followed by theatrical shouts and applause. The normalcy of it all felt obscene in contrast to the horror contained in the papers spread before them. Then we'll find another way, Naraya insisted. There has to be... She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes fixed on something behind him. Before Cassian could turn around, a familiar voice cut through the market's ambient noise like a knife through silk. There you are, darling, Odessa said sweetly. I've been so worried about you. The bustling sounds of Pike Place Market seemed to fade into an eerie silence as Odessa stood before their table, perfectly composed in her beige cardigan and sensible shoes. To any observer, she looked exactly like what she pretended to be, a concerned mother searching for her troubled son. But Cassian could see the predatory gleam in her eyes as they darted between him and Naraya, then fixed on the scattered papers between them. I've been calling hospitals all over Seattle, Odessa said, her voice trembling with well-practiced concern. Several market-goers glanced their way sympathetically. When you started talking about conspiracies and murders, well, I feared you were having an episode like your poor father. Cassian's hands clenched under the table. Every word was carefully chosen, laying the groundwork for whatever she had planned next. He could almost admire the artistry of it. How she wove truth and lies together so seamlessly that even he sometimes struggled to separate them. How did you find us? Naraya demanded, her voice sharp with fear and anger. She began gathering the papers quickly, but Odessa's eyes had already taken in their contents. A mother always knows, Odessa replied softly, but her smile held no warmth. And really, Martha should know better than to share confidential medical records. Such a shame about her upcoming accident. The casual way she referenced the nurse's future death sent chills down Cassian's spine. You won't touch her, he said, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. Several heads turned their way. Odessa's eyes filled with tears on command. You see, she said to the growing crowd of onlookers, this is exactly what I was afraid of. The paranoid delusions, the aggressive behavior. She reached into her purse and Cassian tensed, expecting a weapon. Instead, she pulled out her phone. I've already called your doctor, darling, The ambulance is on its way. The same playbook she'd used with his father. Get him committed, discredit anything he might say, and then... Cassian felt the walls closing in. But this time was different. This time he had evidence. Tell them about Caroline Matthews, he said, loudly, watching her face. The nurse who accidentally fell down her stairs after asking questions about Dad's death. Or about your first husband in Michigan. Did he have paranoid delusions too before his convenient suicide? For just a moment, Odessa's mask slipped. The look she gave him was pure venom, quickly hidden behind concerned tears. You see how sick he's become? She said to the gathered crowd. Just like his father, making up horrible stories. They're not stories, Nariah interjected, standing beside Cassian. We have proof. Hospital records, toxicology reports, witness statements. And such a shame about all those records, Odessa cut in smoothly. From somewhere in the distance, sirens began to wail. Files can be so easily lost. Buildings can burn. People can have accidents. Her eyes locked onto Nariah's, especially people who interfere in family matters. The threat hung in the air like poison. Cassian moved instinctively to shield Nariah, but Odessa just smiled. A cold, triumphant smile that reminded him of a snake about to strike. The ambulance will be here soon, she said, her voice dripping with false maternal concern. Don't worry, darling. Mother will take care of everything, just like I always have. But as she reached for him, something in Cassian finally snapped. Years of suppressed memories flooded back, not just of his father's death, but of countless, small moments when he'd seen the monster beneath her mask and forced himself to forget. No, he said, his voice stronger than he'd ever heard it. This ends now. He turned to the crowd, which had grown larger with each passing moment. My mother is a murderer. She killed my father through slow poisoning, made it look like suicide. She's killed others, and now she's trying to do the same to me. The sirens were getting closer. Odessa's face hardened, all pretense of motherly concern vanishing. Nobody will believe you, she hissed, low enough that only he and Nariah could hear. They never have. They never will. You're just the disturbed son of a tragic family having a breakdown in public. By tonight you'll be safely locked away, and then... Her smile turned cruel. Well, we both know what happens next. But Cassian wasn't finished. He pulled out his phone, held it up so she could see the red recording light. I've been recording everything since you arrived, he said, watching her face drain of color. Every threat, every admission. And it's already uploaded to the cloud. Copies sent to multiple people. A lie, but one she couldn't risk disproving. For the first time in his life, Cassian saw real fear in his mother's eyes. The sirens reached a crescendo as an ambulance pulled up to the market's entrance, followed by 2 police cars. But now, instead of looking triumphant, Odessa looked trapped. It's over, Mother, Cassian said quietly. You can't manipulate your way out of this one. No more convenient accidents. No more mysterious suicides. Just the truth, finally coming to light. The hatred that flashed across her face was completely inhuman. In that moment, she dropped all pretense, revealing the monster that had always lurked beneath the surface. And as the police officers approached, drawn by the gathering crowd, Odessa made one last desperate play. He's trying to kill me, she screamed, her voice echoing through the market. Help! My son's having a psychotic break. But this time her performance fell flat. The crowd had heard too much, seen too much of her mask slipping. And as the officers reached them, Nariah was already holding out the file of evidence, her voice steady as she began to explain exactly who the real monster was. The Seattle Police Department interrogation room was cold and sterile, its harsh fluorescent lights casting unforgiving shadows across Odessa's face. Gone was the carefully maintained facade of the fragile mother. In its place sat something harder, colder, like a statue carved from ice. Detective Sarah Martinez watched through the one-way glass as Odessa stared straight ahead, that unnerving smile still playing at the corners of her mouth. She hasn't asked for a lawyer, Martinez said, glancing at the thick file of evidence spread across the observation room table. Hasn't said a word since we brought her in. She turned to Cassian, who stood rigid beside her, his face pale under the harsh lighting. That's not normal for someone facing multiple murder charges. The evidence was overwhelming once they knew where to look. Martha's detailed records from the psychiatric hospital, the suspicious death of Caroline Matthews, the exhumation order for Odessa's first husband in Michigan had revealed toxic levels of arsenic in his preserved hair samples. And now, the lab results from Cassian's own blood work showed the same poison building up in his system. But still, Odessa sat and smiled. "She's playing some game," Cassian said, his voice hoarse. "She always is. The past 48 hours felt like a nightmare. The confrontation at Pike Place Market, the endless questioning, the horrifying revelations that kept coming as more victims were uncovered. Yet somehow Odessa remained perfectly composed, as if she were still the one in control." A young officer burst into the observation room, his face flushed with urgency. "Detective, you need to see this." He thrust a paper into Martinez's hands. "It just came in from the lab." Martinez's face darkened as she read. "The soup samples from your apartment," she said to Cassian. "The levels of arsenic were lethal. One more bowl would have—" She trailed off, but Cassian understood. He'd been one meal away from joining his father. Finally, Martinez entered the interrogation room. Odessa's smile widened slightly, like a predator acknowledging another predator's presence. The detective laid out the lab reports one by one. "We know everything," Martinez said firmly. "The poisonings, the murders, the elaborate cover-ups. It's over, Mrs. Hale." Odessa's laugh was like breaking glass. "Over?" She leaned forward, all pretense of frailty gone. "My dear, it's never over. Do you think you're the first to try to stop me? To think you understood my game?" Her eyes flickered to the one-way glass, and Cassian felt her gaze pierce him as surely as if she could see right through it. "I've spent decades perfecting this performance," she continued, her voice taking on an almost dreamy quality. "The devoted mother, the grieving widow, the pillar of the community. Do you know how many people still don't believe you? How many called the station to defend my character?" Her smile turned cruel. "Seeds of doubt planted over years. They'll always wonder if my poor troubled son simply snapped under the pressure." Martinez started to speak, but Odessa wasn't finished. "And the best part? The part that will haunt my darling boy forever?" She reached into her cardigan pocket slowly, deliberately. The detective tensed, but Odessa merely withdrew a small, folded piece of paper. "He'll never know how many others there were. How many lives I touched with my special brand of motherly love." She placed the paper on the table and unfolded it carefully. It was a list of names, dozens of them, dates stretching back decades. Some Cassian recognized from the investigation, others were completely unknown. "A confession?" Martinez asked, her voice steady despite the horror of what the list implied. "A legacy," Odessa corrected. "My life's work. Some were poisoned, yes. Others... Well, there are so many ways a caring mother can help ease suffering." Her eyes found the mirror again. "Remember when you had strep throat as a child, Cassian? How I nursed you back to health? Your friend Tommy had it too. Such a shame about his allergic reaction to the penicillin. If only someone had known about his allergy." Behind the glass, Cassian felt his knees buckle. Tommy Peterson, his best friend in 3rd grade. The first time he'd experienced death, up close. He'd cried for weeks and his mother had comforted him, had helped him through his grief. "Why?" Martinez demanded, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. "Why kill innocent people?" Odessa's smile never wavered. "Because I could. Because they were mine to do with as I pleased. Every death was a gift, a lesson in loss, in dependency, and the special bond between mother and child." She turned fully toward the mirror now. "Everything I did for love. My perfect, pure love. And deep down, Cassian knows he'll never escape it. Even now, part of him still craves my approval, my affection. Don't you, darling?" The worst part was, She was right. Even knowing everything she'd done, some broken part of him still yearned for her love, still wanted to believe there was something salvageable in their relationship. It was a poison deeper than any she'd ever slipped into his food, the toxic love that had shaped his entire life. "You're wrong," he said, pressing the intercom button so she could hear him. "I'm not yours anymore. I never really was." For the first time, Odessa's smile faltered. But then she reached into her pocket again, faster than anyone could react. The capsule was in her mouth before Martinez could stop her. "Always mine," she whispered as the cyanide began to take effect. Until the very end. Her final smile, as the poison she had used to kill so many others claimed her as its last victim, would haunt Cassian's dreams forever. The weeks following Odessa's death felt like walking through a fog. The Seattle autumn had turned harsh and cold, matching the numbness that had settled into Cassian's bones. The investigation continued to uncover more victims, a seemingly endless parade of lives touched by his mother's poisonous brand of love. Each new revelation was like a fresh wound, forcing him to re-examine every memory, every childhood moment he'd once thought innocent. His apartment, once a haven, now felt contaminated. Every surface seemed to hold echoes of Odessa's presence. The kitchen where she'd prepared countless poisoned meals, the living room where she'd sat in her recliner like a spider at the center of her web. The police had taken most of it as evidence, but they couldn't remove the shadows that lingered in every corner. Naraya found him there one rainy evening, sitting in the dark among half-packed moving boxes. She didn't turn on the lights, just sat beside him on the floor, her shoulder touching his in silent support. The sound of rain against the windows filled the silence between them. "They found another one today," Cassian said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "A girl I knew in high school, Sarah Mitchell. She used to come over to study. One day she just disappeared. Mom told me she'd moved to Chicago." He laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Turns out she never left Seattle. They found her body in the foundations of an old building. Mom had been on the renovation committee back then." Naraya's hand found his in the darkness. "It's not your fault," she said softly. "You were a child. She fooled everyone." But the guilt wasn't so easily dismissed. The police had finally finished processing Odessa's list. 37 names in total, spanning over 3 decades. Some were obvious murders, others so carefully orchestrated they'd never be proven. And each death had served a purpose in Odessa's twisted game, shaping Cassian's life like a sculptor chipping away at marble until only what she wanted remained. "I keep thinking about Dad," he admitted, staring into the darkness. "How hard he must have fought to save me. How terrified he must have been in that hospital, knowing what she was doing but unable to make anyone believe him." The memory of his father's face in that old photograph haunted him. Those eyes that had seen the monster behind the mask but couldn't escape it. Detective Martinez had brought over the last of the case files that morning. Odessa's journals, recovered from a safety deposit box, revealed the full scope of her methodical madness. She documented everything, every poison, every manipulation, every carefully orchestrated accident. The most disturbing entries were about Cassian himself, detailing how she'd molded him from infancy, isolating him, creating dependencies, eliminating anyone who threatened her control. "I was her masterpiece," he whispered into the darkness. "Her greatest creation. She spent years making sure I would never be strong enough to leave her, never able to form connections she couldn't break. Even now," he swallowed hard, "even now part of me misses her." How sick is that? Naraya's grip on his hand tightened. "It's not sick. It's human. She was your mother. Loving her was hardwired into your DNA. But you broke free. You survived. But survival came with its own burden." The media had latched onto the story. The Black Widow mother of Seattle made for sensational headlines. Cassian couldn't go anywhere without feeling eyes on him, wondering if he shared his mother's capacity for evil. Some of her defenders still insisted he was mentally ill, that he'd fabricated everything to escape her control. The irony of them, Unknowingly using her own tactics to defend her wasn't lost on him. "I have to sell this place," he said suddenly. I can't live with her ghost anymore. Every time I walk into the kitchen, I remember her standing there, stirring her pots of poison. Every time I look at that chair," he gestured to the empty corner where her recliner had been, "I see her watching me, planning her next move." "Then, we'll sell it," Naraya said simply. "We'll find a new place, make new memories. She doesn't get to haunt you anymore." The simplicity of her statement, "We'll find a new place," brought unexpected tears to his eyes. After everything he'd done, everything that had happened, she was still here, still willing to help him rebuild from the ashes of his mother's destruction. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. But Naraya shook her head. "What you deserve is a chance to live without her shadow over you, to find out who you are when you're not being manipulated and poisoned by someone who claimed to love you." She stood up, pulling him with her. "Come on. You shouldn't be alone here tonight." As they left the apartment, Cassian paused in the doorway, looking back at the dark space that had been the stage for so much hidden horror. He could almost see Odessa there, sitting in her chair, stirring her soups, weaving her web of lies and poison. But her power was broken now. Her final act of control, choosing the manner of her own death, would be her last. Tomorrow, he would start the process of untangling himself from her legacy. There would be more victims to identify, more families to notify, more ghosts to lay to rest. But tonight, walking away from the apartment with Naraya beside him, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the first fragile stirrings of freedom. Spring had returned to Seattle, the cherry blossoms along University Way painting the air with delicate pink petals. 6 months had passed since Odessa's death, and Cassian sat in his new therapist's office, watching the flowers dance in the breeze outside the window. Dr. Chen's office was nothing like the stark psychiatric hospital where his father had spent his final days. Here, warm sunlight filtered through bamboo blinds, and the gentle sound of a water fountain created a sense of peace. "You've made remarkable progress," Dr. Chen said, her voice gentle but firm. "But you mentioned having the dream again?" She adjusted her glasses, waiting patiently as Cassian gathered his thoughts. "It's always the same," he began, his fingers absently tracing the arm of the leather chair. "I'm a child again, sitting at our old kitchen table. Mom's making soup, humming that song she always used to hum, 'You Are My Sunshine.' But in the dream, I can see what's in her other hand. The bottles of poison she kept hidden behind the spices. I try to scream to warn everyone, but no sound comes out. And then I see them all, Dad, Tommy Peterson, Sarah Mitchell, all her victims, sitting at the table waiting to eat. And she just keeps stirring, smiling, singing." He stopped, the memory of the dream making his throat tight. On his last visit to the police station, Detective Martinez had shown him the final tally: 42 confirmed victims over 35 years. Some cases would never be solved, the evidence long destroyed by time and Odessa's meticulous planning. "The guilt still haunts you," Dr. Chen observed. "You feel responsible for not seeing it sooner." "I should have known," Cassian whispered. "All those people who disappeared from my life, friends, teachers, neighbors, anyone who got too close or asked too many questions. She had me so completely under her control that I accepted every explanation, every lie." The police had found Odessa's detailed journals hidden in a storage unit across town. Page after page of careful observations, tracking her son's development, like a scientist monitoring an experiment. She'd noted every successful manipulation, every poisoning, every carefully orchestrated isolation. "Subject responds well to induced illness followed by maternal care," she'd written when he was 7. "Dependency levels increasing as planned." "You were a child," Dr. Chen reminded him gently. "She spent years constructing an alternate reality around you. The fact that you broke free at all is remarkable. Remarkable but not complete." Even now, months after her death, Cassian sometimes caught himself missing her. The realization always made him sick. But Dr. Chen had helped him understand that it was normal. The traumatic bonds she'd created wouldn't disappear overnight. After the session, Cassian drove to the small house he now shared with Naraya in Ballard. They'd bought it together 3 months ago, a fresh start away from the shadows of his past. The garden was Naraya's project, her way of replacing Odessa's poisonous legacy with something life-giving. Today, he could see her kneeling among the newly planted herbs, coaxing green things from the earth. "How was therapy?" she asked as he joined her in the garden. Her hands were dirty from planting, and a smudge of soil marked her cheek. The sight made his heart ache with love. This simple, honest connection so different from his mother's toxic version of love. "Good," he said, settling beside her on the grass. "We talked about the dreams again, about guilt, about..." He hesitated, then continued, "about having children someday." Naraya's hands stilled in the dirt. They'd discussed this before. His fear that something of Odessa lived in his genes, that he might carry some hereditary capacity for evil. "You're not her," Naraya said firmly. "You never were. And any child of ours will be raised with real love, not the twisted version she called love." Inside, on their kitchen counter, sat a copper soup pot, a housewarming gift from Martha, the nurse who had tried to save his father. "Reclaim what she took from you," Martha had said. "Don't let her steal the simple pleasures of life." Last night, for the first time since Odessa's death, Cassian had made soup in that pot. His hands had trembled as he chopped vegetables, fighting back memories of his mother at her stove. But the simple act of creating something nourishing, something meant to heal rather than harm, had felt like a small victory. "I got a letter from Tommy Peterson's mother today," he said softly. The investigation had brought him in contact with many of his mother's victims' families. Some blamed him, others saw him as another victim. Mrs. Peterson had been different. She wants to meet for coffee, to talk about Tommy, share memories from before Mom got to him. Naraya squeezed his hand, understanding the significance. Each connection rebuilt, each memory reclaimed from Odessa's poison, was a step toward healing. As the spring breeze carried the scent of new growth and possibility, Cassian looked at their small house, at Naraya's garden, at the life they were building together. His mother had spent decades trying to ensure he would never escape her influence, never form genuine connections, never know real love. In death, as in life, she had tried to maintain her control through guilt and fear and toxic memories. But, sitting here, watching Naraya plant seeds that would grow into something beautiful and nurturing, Cassian felt the last of his mother's poison finally beginning to fade. The circle of manipulation and death she had created was broken. In its place, something new was growing, something real, something healthy, something free. "We're going to be okay," he said, and for the first time,